October 1942. You know what's crazy? While most armies were busy trying to outgun and outmaneuver each other in World War II, a group of British soldiers in North Africa figured out they could use alcohol as a weapon, not to drink themselves into courage, but to literally trick the Germans into thinking they were somewhere they weren't. And it worked, multiple times. This is the story of how tea-loving British soldiers gave up their most sacred beverage, traded it for whiskey they didn't even want, and used it to completely mess with German intelligence in the Western Desert. It sounds made up, but I promise you this actually happened. So let me take you back to 1942. The North African campaign is in full swing. Rommel's Afrika Korps is pushing hard against Allied forces, and the British are scrambling to hold their ground. The desert is brutal. Temperatures hit 120 degrees during the day and drop to freezing at night. Sand gets everywhere. Your equipment breaks down constantly. Water is more valuable than gold. And if you're British, the lack of proper tea is basically a war crime. Now, in this environment, you've got these small reconnaissance units. Their job is to go deep behind enemy lines, watch German movements, report back, and occasionally cause some chaos. These aren't your regular infantry guys sitting in trenches. These are the Long-Range Desert Group, the SAS, and various other specialized units that basically lived in the desert for weeks at a time. Here's where it gets interesting. The Germans had patrols too, obviously, and both sides knew that if you could capture enemy soldiers, you could get information. Interrogate them, find out troop positions, supply routes, all that good stuff. So both the British and Germans were constantly trying to grab prisoners. The British had a problem, though. Their reconnaissance units were small, usually just a handful of guys in a couple of trucks. If they ran into a German patrol, they couldn't exactly fight their way out against superior numbers. And they definitely couldn't afford to get caught because they knew way too much about British positions and plans. So this is where some absolute genius came up with an idea that sounds so stupid it just might work. And it did work, repeatedly. The plan was simple in concept, but required some serious commitment. British soldiers would deliberately leave behind supplies when they evacuated a position or moved camps. Not just any supplies, though. They'd leave whiskey, good whiskey, bottles and bottles of it. Sometimes they'd even leave half-drunk bottles sitting around like they'd left in a hurry. Now you might be thinking, okay, free booze, what's the big deal? Here's the thing. These British soldiers had to actually acquire this whiskey first. And remember, this is the desert. Supply lines are stretched thin. Everything has to be shipped in from thousands of miles away. The British Army isn't exactly known for being generous with alcohol rations, so these guys were trading their tea, their precious, sacred, absolutely essential tea. British soldiers in World War II took their tea seriously. It wasn't just a drink, it was a morale thing. It was a piece of home. It was what you had before battle and after battle and during battle if you could manage it. Officers would make sure their men got tea even when ammunition was running low. And these reconnaissance guys were giving up their tea rations to get whiskey from other units. They'd go to supply depots, find whoever had whiskey, and trade their tea for it. Then they'd take this whiskey they didn't even want and leave it out in the desert like bait. The German patrols would find these abandoned British positions, see the whiskey, and think they'd hit the jackpot. Free alcohol in the middle of the desert? Of course they're taking it, and of course they're drinking it, wouldn't you? But here's the genius part. The British weren't just leaving whiskey randomly. They were leaving it in specific patterns, in specific locations, timed with specific movements. They were creating a trail of breadcrumbs that told a story. Let me give you an example of how this actually played out. A British unit would set up camp in one location. They'd stay there for a few days, make it look lived in, leave tracks everywhere. Then they'd pack up and move, but they'd leave behind clear signs of a hasty retreat. Equipment scattered around, half-eaten food, and most importantly, several bottles of whiskey, some opened, some not. German patrols would find this and report back. British unit was here, they left in a hurry, heading in this direction based on the vehicle tracks, and the Germans would follow those tracks. Meanwhile, the British unit would do the same thing again 20 miles away. Another camp, more signs of hasty departure, more whiskey. The Germans would find this one too and update their intelligence. The British are retreating in this direction, they're moving fast, they're disorganized enough to leave valuable supplies behind. Except the British weren't retreating, they were leading the Germans on a wild goose chase. The real British positions were somewhere completely different, or sometimes the British were actually circling back to hit German supply lines, while the German patrols were busy following fake trails and drinking free whiskey. This worked for several reasons. First, the whiskey was real and good quality. It had to be, or the Germans wouldn't believe it was genuine British supplies. If you're trying to trick someone, you can't use fake or cheap stuff. They'll know. Second, the Germans knew British soldiers loved their alcohol. Everyone did. Soldiers of every nation would take alcohol if they found it. It wasn't suspicious that British troops might leave some behind if they were retreating under pressure. It made the whole scenario believable. Third, and this is the clever bit, the whiskey actually impaired the German patrol's ability to function. They'd find this alcohol, they'd drink it because why wouldn't you, and then they'd be slightly less alert, slightly less sharp. Not fall down drunk, but enough that they'd miss details they might otherwise catch. Enough that they'd be slower to react if the British did ambush them. There are documented cases where German patrol reports noted finding British supplies, including alcohol, and then those same patrols either lost the British trail completely or ended up in the wrong area entirely. British after-action reports would sometimes mention that German response times seemed slower or their pursuit less aggressive after they'd left whiskey behind. One particular incident involved a British SAS unit that was trying to reach a German airfield to blow up planes. They knew there were multiple German patrols between them and their target, so over 3 days they set up a series of fake camps, each one with whiskey, each one suggesting they were moving south, away from the airfield. The Germans found the first camp, then the second, then the third. They concluded the British were retreating south and repositioned their patrols accordingly. Meanwhile, the SAS unit had actually been moving northwest the whole time. They hit the airfield, destroyed a dozen planes, and got out before the Germans even realized they'd been tricked. The thing is, this strategy required real sacrifice from the British soldiers. Giving up tea wasn't a small thing. It sounds funny to us now, but imagine you're in the desert, it's hot, you're tired, you're scared, and the one comfort you have is a cup of tea, and your commanding officer tells you to trade your tea rations for whiskey that you're not even going to drink. You're going to give it to the enemy. Some soldiers refused at first. They genuinely couldn't imagine giving up their tea. Officers had to explain the strategic value, had to promise they'd get replacement tea eventually, had to basically plead with their men to make this sacrifice for the greater mission. But once they saw it work, once they saw German patrols go chasing after fake trails while the real British positions stayed hidden, they got on board. It became almost a game. Units would compete to see who could create the most convincing abandoned camp, who could lead the Germans on the longest wild goose chase. There's a story about one unit that got really creative. They didn't just leave whiskey. They left a partially burned map with fake coordinates marked on it. They left personal letters, also partially burned, that mentioned fictitious troop movements. They left a broken radio that German technicians could theoretically repair and use, except it had been sabotaged in a way that wasn't immediately obvious. The Germans found all this and spent 2 weeks analyzing the intelligence, trying to repair the radio, moving patrols based on the coordinates from the map, all completely fake, all completely useless. Meanwhile, the British unit that planted this stuff was 60 miles away, doing actual damage to German supply convoys. Now, the Germans weren't stupid. Eventually, they started to catch on that something weird was happening. They noticed that British units seemed to leave behind supplies more often than made sense. They started to question why the British would abandon good whiskey so frequently. Some German officers issued orders to their patrols not to drink any alcohol they found. Some ordered that all discovered supplies should be treated as potentially poisoned or booby-trapped. But here's the thing about soldiers in the desert: finding whiskey is like finding treasure. Even with orders not to touch it, some guys are going to drink it anyway. And the British knew this. Human nature is human nature. You can order soldiers not to do something, but if you put a bottle of good whiskey in front of a man who's been eating sand and drinking warm water for weeks, there's a decent chance he's going to take a sip when his officer isn't looking. So the strategy kept working, just less reliably than before. The British had to get more creative. Instead of just leaving bottles out in the open, they'd hide them in places where German soldiers would find them and feel like they'd discovered something their officers didn't know about. Hidden in a supply crate, buried shallow in the sand, tucked into a vehicle that looked abandoned. The psychology here is brilliant. If a soldier finds alcohol that his officer already knows about and has ordered him not to touch, he might resist temptation. But if he finds alcohol that he thinks nobody else knows about, that he discovered on his own, he's much more likely to drink it and keep it quiet. There's a British intelligence report from late 1942 that mentions German patrol efficiency dropping noticeably in certain sectors where British reconnaissance units had been active. The report speculates that the Germans were either stretched too thin, dealing with equipment failures, or, and I'm quoting here, possibly experiencing reduced alertness due to discovered supplies. That's British military speak for they're drunk. The wildest part of this whole story is that the British didn't invent this tactic in North Africa. Similar strategies had been used before in other conflicts, but never quite like this. What made the North African version special was the scale and the coordination. This wasn't just one unit doing something clever once. This was multiple units across hundreds of miles of desert, all using the same basic strategy of trading tea for whiskey and using it to manipulate German intelligence. There were whole supply chains set up just to facilitate this. Certain supply officers became known as the guys who would trade whiskey for tea, no questions asked. Some units would stockpile whiskey specifically for these operations. There are requisition forms in British archives where officers are requesting whiskey in quantities that make no sense unless you know what they were actually using it for. And it wasn't just whiskey. Sometimes they'd use rum, sometimes gin, whatever they could get their hands on. The key was that it had to be real alcohol, it had to be good quality, and it had to be something German soldiers would believably drink. They also started adding other elements to make the deception more convincing. They'd leave food, but the food would be partially spoiled, suggesting the British had been there days ago, not hours. They'd leave ammunition, but the wrong caliber for the weapons the Germans knew that British unit carried, suggesting resupply confusion or desperation. One unit left behind a crate of British Army boots, all in different sizes, with a requisition form showing they were meant for a completely different unit in a completely different sector. The Germans found this and spent considerable effort trying to figure out why boots were being shipped to the wrong unit, whether this indicated supply problems, whether British logistics were breaking down. It was all fake. The boots were worn out and scheduled to be destroyed anyway, but the Germans didn't know that. The level of detail in these deceptions was sometimes absurd. British soldiers would write fake diary entries and leave them behind. They'd create false identities for made-up soldiers and leave personal effects with those names on them. They'd take photographs, real photographs developed in actual darkrooms, showing British troops in locations where those troops had never actually been. All of this combined with the whiskey, created a picture of British forces that was completely wrong. German intelligence maps of British positions in late 1942 show units in places they never were, moving in directions they never moved, with supply problems they never had. And the British, meanwhile, knew exactly where the Germans thought they were, which meant they knew where the Germans weren't looking. That's where they'd actually operate. There's a particular battle, I won't name it specifically, because it involves classified details that are still sensitive, but there's a battle where British forces achieved complete surprise against a German position that should have been impossible to surprise. The Germans had patrols out, they had reconnaissance, they had everything you'd need to know if an attack was coming. But those patrols had been following false trails for weeks. Those reconnaissance reports were based on planted evidence. When the British attacked, they came from a direction the Germans had written off as impossible, because their intelligence said British forces were 60 miles away in the opposite direction. The Germans were so convinced of their intelligence that when the attack started, some German officers initially thought it must be a different British unit, one they didn't know about, because the unit they were tracking was supposedly far away. It was the same unit. It had never been where the Germans thought it was. Now, I want to be clear about something. This wasn't the deciding factor in the North African campaign. The British didn't win because of whiskey. They won because of superior logistics, American reinforcement, breaking of German codes, and 100 other factors that were way more important than this. But this tactic did save lives. Every German patrol that was looking in the wrong place was a patrol that wasn't finding real British positions. Every hour the Germans spent analysing false intelligence was an hour they weren't preparing for real attacks. Every ambush that didn't happen because the British weren't where the Germans expected them to be was British soldiers who made it home. The soldiers who gave up their tea for this, they didn't do it because they thought it would win the war. They did it because their officers told them it would keep their mates alive. And it did. After the North African campaign ended, some of these tactics were studied and refined. They were used in other theatres, adapted for different situations. The basic principle, using human nature and expected behaviour to create believable deceptions, that became standard practice in military intelligence operations. There are guys who fought in North Africa who never knew this was happening. Regular infantry soldiers who had no idea that somewhere behind enemy lines, reconnaissance units were playing elaborate mind games with the Germans using booze as a weapon. And there are German veterans who fought in North Africa who probably still don't know why their intelligence was so consistently wrong in certain areas. They might remember finding British supplies, they might remember following trails that led nowhere, but they likely never connected the dots to realise they were being deliberately deceived. The British, for their part, didn't talk about this much after the war. It's not the kind of thing that makes for good propaganda or impressive war stories. You can't exactly put, "We got the Germans drunk and then snuck around them" on a recruitment poster, but it worked. That's the thing that gets me about this story. It sounds like something from a comedy sketch. British soldiers giving up tea, the most stereotypically British thing possible, to get whiskey, to give to Germans, to trick them into looking the wrong way. It's almost too perfect, too on the nose. But it was real. There are documents, after-action reports, supply requisitions, intelligence summaries, all confirming that this happened, multiple times, across months, involving hundreds of soldiers on both sides. And the reason it worked wasn't because the Germans were stupid or the British were geniuses. It worked because the British understood something fundamental about human behaviour. People see what they expect to see. If you find abandoned supplies, you assume someone left in a hurry. If you find alcohol, you assume it's valuable and you take it. If tracks lead in a direction, you assume that's where the enemy went. The British took these assumptions, these natural human reactions, and weaponized them. They turned the desert itself into a stage where they could control what the Germans saw, what they found, what conclusions they drew. It's actually kind of brilliant when you think about it. They didn't try to hide. They left obvious signs of their presence, but those signs told a story that wasn't true. The Germans were looking right at British deception operations and seeing exactly what the British wanted them to see. There's a broader lesson here about warfare and intelligence. The most effective deceptions aren't the ones where you try to be invisible. They're the ones where you give the enemy something to find, something that confirms what they already suspect or expect, something that leads them exactly where you want them to go. The whiskey was just the bait. The real weapon was the story it told. And somewhere in the Western Desert, in the sand and the heat and the chaos of war, British soldiers proved that sometimes the best way to fight isn't to fire more bullets. Sometimes it's to pour a drink, leave it where your enemy will find it, and let human nature do the rest. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this.